The water came without warning, and it came fast. One moment the riverbank held steady behind the old stone wall, and the next moment the wall was gone, swallowed whole by a wave of brown water that roared down from the hills like something alive and furious. Alpha King Draven Ashcroft had been standing on the ridge above the border levee, arms crossed, watching his engineers argue about a crack in the concrete, when the ground beneath everyone's feet simply stopped existing. He heard the shout before he understood it. He turned his head just in time to see a wall of water crash into the ridge, and then there was no ground at all, only cold and dark, and the terrible feeling of being thrown like a stone from a sling. His shoulder struck something hard. His vision snapped white, then red, then nothing. Somewhere above the surface, in the part of the flood that still remembered how to be a river instead of a monster, a woman was running along the bank with her lungs burning, and her bare feet cut open on broken stone. She had seen him fall. She had seen the current take him under a mess of splintered wood and drowned trees, and something in her chest told her, with total certainty, that if she did not move right now, a man was going to die within sight of her. She did not know his name. She did not know he commanded armies, that thousands of wolves called him Alpha, that his portrait hung in council halls 200 miles from where she now stood. She only knew that a person was drowning, and she was the only one close enough to reach him. She dove. The cold hit her like a slap, driving the air from her chest in one violent gasp that she barely managed to hold back. The current grabbed her immediately, spinning her, dragging her downstream faster than she could fight. She kicked hard, forcing her body toward the place she had last seen him go under, praying to whatever was listening that she wasn't already too late. Her hand closed on fabric. She pulled, and pain shot through her shoulder, but she did not let go. She kicked toward the surface with everything she had left, hauling a body that felt impossibly heavy, a body built of muscle and height that outweighed her by nearly double. Her lungs screamed. Black spots crowded the edges of her vision. Still she kicked. They broke the surface together, and she gasped in air like it was the first breath she had ever taken. He did not gasp. He did not move at all. His head lolled against her arm, and for one terrible second she thought she had failed, that she had thrown her own life away for nothing. There was no time to think about that. The current was still pulling them both toward a bend in the river, where the water churned white over broken rock. If they went over that, neither of them would survive it. She turned onto her back, hooked her arm across his chest, the way she had once seen a fisherman do with a drowning child, and swam sideways, cutting across the current instead of fighting it head-on. Every stroke felt like dragging herself through wet cement. Her cut feet found nothing to push against. Her vision blurred with river water and exhaustion. Then, finally, her knee scraped against something solid, ground. She dragged them both toward it, inch by inch, until she collapsed onto a muddy slope with the man's full weight pinning half her body beneath him. She rolled him onto his back. He was not breathing. She had learned this once, years ago, from an old woman in a camp who had lost count of how many refugees she'd pulled back from the edge of drowning during storm season. Tilt the head, clear the mouth. Press down hard, count, breathe, repeat. Her hands remembered, even when her mind was too tired to think. She pressed her palms against his chest and pushed, counting under her breath, her own body shaking from cold and effort. On the fourth cycle, he coughed. River water spilled from his mouth, and his whole body convulsed as he rolled onto his side, choking, gasping, alive. She sat back on her heels in the mud and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel relief before her mind caught up with her surroundings. The flood was still rising. The bank where they had landed would not hold for long. She looked at the man beside her, tall, broad-shouldered, unconscious eyes fluttering as he fought his way back to awareness, dressed in clothes far too fine for anyone she knew, and she made a decision. She could not leave him here. And she could not carry him far on her own strength, not with her legs already trembling and her vision swimming from exhaustion. But there was an old barn on higher ground, half a mile inland, that she had passed 100 times gathering firewood. It would have to be enough. She got her shoulder under his arm, braced her legs, and stood, dragging him up with her. He was barely conscious, his feet finding just enough purchase to stumble alongside her, rather than being pure dead weight. But even that little effort from him made the difference between possible and impossible. Step by step, through mud that sucked at her ankles, and rain that had started falling again in heavy, stinging sheets, she got him moving. It felt like an hour. It was probably 20 minutes. By the time the barn's leaning silhouette came into view, her arms had gone numb, and her breath came in ragged tears. She kicked the door open with the last of her strength, and half carried, half dropped him onto a bed of old straw inside, then collapsed beside him, chest heaving, rain still dripping from her hair onto the dusty floor. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Outside, the flood roared on, indifferent to what it had almost taken and almost kept. She forced herself upright first. There was work to do, and she had learned long ago that falling apart could wait until the danger had passed. She tore a strip from the bottom of her already ruined shirt and used it to bind a gash on his forearm that was still weeping blood. She found an old horse blanket, moth-eaten but dry, folded over a stall rail, and pulled it over him. She checked his pulse the way she checked everything in her life now. Quickly, quietly, without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing it at all. His pulse was strong, steady. He would live. Only then did she let herself sit back against the barn wall and breathe. It was there, in the gray light leaking through cracks in the old wooden boards, that she finally looked at him properly. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with dark hair plastered flat against his forehead, and a jaw that even unconscious looked like it had never once apologized for anything. There was an authority in his face that had nothing to do with being awake to use it. She had seen men like this before, from a distance, men who walked through crowds and watched them part like water around a stone. She had learned, a long time ago, to stay far away from men like this. And yet here she was, sitting in a collapsing barn in the middle of a flood, having just pulled one out of a river with her bare hands. She almost laughed. The sound that came out instead was closer to a sob, quickly swallowed. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, and made herself breathe slowly, until the urge passed. There was no room for that. Not here, not now, maybe not ever, if she was being honest with herself. The rain kept falling. Somewhere outside, she could hear the flood still tearing through the valley, snapping trees, carrying away things that people had spent years building. She thought of Camp 7, of the tents that would not survive this kind of water, of the people who had even less than she did, and no barn to shelter in. She should go back. She should be there, helping however she could. But she could not leave a half-drowned man alone in a collapsing barn either. So she stayed. Hours passed. She dozed once, sitting upright against the wall, and woke with a start to find the light outside had shifted from storm gray to the deeper gray of evening. The man had not moved from where she'd left him, but his breathing had changed, deeper, more even, the ragged edge gone from it. She crawled closer and pressed 2 fingers lightly to his wrist again, pulse strong, skin warmer than before. Good signs, all of them. She was still crouched beside him when his eyes opened. For a moment, he simply stared at the ceiling, at the cracked wooden beams above him, his brow furrowed like a man trying to remember a dream that was already slipping away. Then his eyes moved, found her, and stopped. Neither of them said anything at first. She watched him take in the barn, the blanket over his chest, the makeshift bandage on his arm, and finally her, soaked to the skin, mud dried in streaks along her jaw, hair plastered to her skull in dark ropes. "You pulled me out," he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw from the water he'd swallowed. "You would have drowned," she said simply, because it was true, and there was no point dressing it up as anything more heroic than fact. He tried to sit up too quickly, and winced, one hand going to his ribs. She reached out on instinct to steady him, then caught herself and pulled her hand back before it touched him. Old habits, old caution. You did not put your hands on strangers, not where she came from, not unless you wanted trouble you couldn't afford. He noticed the retreat. Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or something closer to curiosity, but he didn't comment on it. "Where are we?" he asked instead. "Old barn, about half a mile from where the levee broke." She kept her voice flat, practical, the way she'd learned to speak to strangers who might be dangerous, might be kind, might be both. "The flood's still bad out there. We should stay until it settles." He studied her for a long moment, longer than felt comfortable. She held his gaze anyway, because looking away first was another thing she'd learned never to do. "You're bleeding," he said finally, nodding toward her leg. She looked down and saw, for the first time, a long, shallow cut along her calf, red and angry against her wet skin. She hadn't even felt it happen. Adrenaline did strange things to a body. "It's nothing," she said, and meant it. She had seen worse. She had caused worse to herself trying to survive worse things than a flood. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he shifted, testing his own strength, and managed to sit up fully against a hay bale without help. For a man who had been unconscious less than an hour ago, he recovered quickly. She noticed that, filed it away the way she filed away every small detail about people she didn't yet trust. "You didn't have to come after me," he said. "No one else was close enough." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him then, really looked, and something about the directness in his question made her pause. Most people didn't ask why. Most people took what they needed and moved on, without wondering what it had cost the person who gave it. "I couldn't watch someone drown and do nothing," she said finally. "That's all it was." He nodded slowly, as if turning her answer over, testing its weight. Outside, thunder rolled again, distant now, the storm finally beginning to loosen its grip on the valley. She found herself grateful for the noise. It gave her somewhere else to look. "What's your name?" he asked. The question landed harder than it should have. She had known it was coming. It always came. Eventually, whenever someone wanted to be polite, wanted to make a connection, wanted to turn a stranger into someone they could remember and thank properly later. She had a dozen ways to avoid answering it. She used one now. "Does it matter?" she said. "You'll be back with your own people soon enough. I'll go back to mine." His eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the sharp attention of someone unused to being deflected. "It matters to me. It shouldn't." She stood before he could press further, brushing dried mud from her palms, putting physical distance between them, because it was easier than finding new ways to dodge the same question. She moved to the barn door and cracked it open, checking the state of the water outside. It had receded slightly from where it had been at the worst of the storm, though the fields beyond were still a churning brown lake, littered with debris, broken fence posts, a child's overturned wagon, the roof of something that had once been someone's home. Her chest tightened at the sight. Camp 7 sat lower than this ridge. If the water had reached this high up here, it would have gone straight through the camp like it wasn't even there. "I need to go," she said, more to herself than to him. "My people are down there." In this? He was on his feet now, unsteady but upright, one hand braced against the stall wall. "You can barely stand." "I can stand fine." It wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough to say without flinching. "You're the one who almost drowned an hour ago." A ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face, quickly gone. "Fair point." She turned back to the door, judging the distance, the current, the fading light. It would be dangerous. It would also be more dangerous to stay away, not knowing whether the people she'd spent years protecting in small, quiet ways were safe, or scattered, or worse. "Wait," he said, and something in his tone made her actually stop. Not command. She knew commands, had learned to recognize the weight of them from men who expected obedience without question, but something closer to a request. "At least let me come with you. 2 people crossing that water is safer than 1. She studied him for a moment. He was still favoring his ribs slightly, his hair still damp and disordered, his fine clothes ruined beyond repair. He did not look like a man used to wading through floodwater to help strangers. And yet here he was, offering exactly that. "You don't even know where you're going," she said. "Then show me." There was something stubborn in the set of his jaw that told her arguing further would waste time she didn't have. She nodded once, sharp and final, and pushed the barn door open the rest of the way. The water outside had cooled from its earlier fury into something merely dangerous instead of deadly, a slow brown current threading between half-submerged fence lines and the skeletal remains of trees. She waded in first, testing the ground with each step, and he followed close behind, close enough that she could hear his breathing, could sense the effort it cost him to keep pace despite his injuries. Neither of them spoke much as they went. The world had narrowed to the immediate task of staying upright, of avoiding the places where the current ran fast and hidden beneath calm-looking surfaces, of watching for debris that could knock a person down without warning. Twice she caught his arm to steady him over uneven ground hidden beneath the water, and twice he did the same for her, and neither of them commented on it. because commenting on it would have meant acknowledging something neither of them had the energy or the right words for yet. The light was almost gone by the time the outline of Camp 7 came into view, a huddle of tents and makeshift shelters on a rise that had, thankfully, stayed just high enough to avoid the worst of the flooding. Fires burned in scattered points across the camp, small orange stars against the darkening blue of evening, and figures moved between them, checking on neighbors, salvaging what could be salvaged. She felt something in her chest loosen at the sight. They had survived, not untouched, not unscathed, but they had survived. "This is where you live," he said quietly beside her. It wasn't quite a question. "This is where I exist," she corrected, and didn't explain further. There was a difference, and she wasn't ready to explain it to a stranger she had known for less than a day, no matter how many rivers they had crossed together in the space of a single afternoon. They reached the edge of the camp as full darkness settled over the valley. People were already gathering, drawn by the movement, by the unfamiliar shape of a well-dressed stranger standing beside a woman most of them recognized only by sight, never by name. Whispers started immediately, the way they always did, in a place where anything new was both danger and entertainment. She felt him glance at her, felt the question forming again behind his eyes. "Who are you? What do I call you? Why won't you tell me?" And she braced herself for it. But he didn't ask again, not yet. Instead, he simply stood beside her, watching the camp settle into its uneasy nighttime rhythm, and said nothing at all. It was, she thought, the first kindness he had shown her that didn't come wrapped in a question she couldn't afford to answer. She did not know, standing there in the mud and the dark with her feet bleeding and her clothes ruined, that the man beside her commanded more power than anyone in that camp could imagine. She did not know that his absence had already sent his court into a controlled panic, that search parties were combing the flooded valley for him at that very moment, that by morning his name would be spoken with the kind of fear and reverence reserved only for kings. All she knew was that she had pulled a drowning stranger from a river because it was the right thing to do, and that some quiet, cautious part of her was already regretting how much she wanted to know his name in return. She pushed the thought away before it could take root. Wanting things, in her life, had never once ended well. The fires burned on around them, small and stubborn against the wreckage the flood had left behind, and somewhere out in the dark, the water was still receding, slowly returning the valley to a world that neither of them yet understood, had already changed forever. Morning came to Camp 7 with a thin gray light and the smell of wet ash. She woke before dawn out of habit, the way she always did, and found the stranger already awake, sitting near the dying embers of a fire someone had built outside her tent, watching the camp stir to life around him, like a man studying an unfamiliar language. He had not left during the night. She had half expected him to disappear the moment her back was turned, to find whatever people came looking for someone like him, and vanish into a life she would never see again. Instead, he sat there in his ruined clothes, mud dried along one sleeve, watching an old woman stack scavenged wood, with a patience that seemed, to her surprise, entirely genuine. "You didn't sleep," she said, crouching beside the fire to warm her hands. "Neither did you." He nodded toward the dark circles she knew were shadowing her own eyes. "I kept thinking about the people who didn't make it to higher ground in time." Something in his voice surprised her, a weight to it that felt too heavy for a stranger passing through. She studied him for a moment, this man who had nearly drowned less than a day ago, and now sat in a refugee camp worrying about people he had never met. "You should go find your own people," she said. "They'll be looking for you." "They will," he agreed, "but not yet." She didn't press him on what that meant. She had learned long ago that people rarely explained themselves fully to strangers, and she had no more right to demand his story than he had to demand hers. Instead, she stood and busied herself with the morning's tasks, checking the water barrels for contamination, helping an older man named Edwin repair a torn tent flap, distributing what little dry food remained from a supply crate that had somehow survived the flood. He watched her work for a while before, without asking, he simply started helping. It surprised her at first, the sight of him hauling water buckets alongside a camp elder, holding a tent pole steady, while someone else hammered it into softened ground, carrying a crate of supplies that most men his size wouldn't have thought twice about leaving for someone else to manage. He did not complain about the mud on his boots, or the ache that still showed in the careful way he moved his ribs. He simply worked, quietly, efficiently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. By mid-morning, Word of the stranger had spread through the camp, the way word always spread in a place with nothing but time and rumor to pass between neighbors. She caught snatches of it as she moved between tents. Who is he? Where did he come from? Did you see the way he carried that water? He doesn't talk like us, does he? She ignored the whispers as best she could, focused on her own work, on the endless list of small emergencies that came with keeping a flood-damaged camp functioning. But she noticed him too, more than she wanted to admit, noticed the careful way he listened when someone spoke to him, the way his eyes tracked the camp's rhythms, like a man memorizing a map he intended to use later. It was near midday when Edwin, patching a hole in his roof with scavenged canvas, asked the question she had been dreading. "What do we call you then?" the old man said, squinting up at the stranger, holding the canvas steady for him. "Can't keep saying the fella from the flood forever." She watched the stranger's expression shift, watched him consider his answer with the same care he seemed to bring to everything. "Draven," he said finally. Just that, no title, no explanation, nothing that would have told Edwin, or anyone else listening, exactly what kind of man they were housing in their camp. "Draven," Edwin repeated, testing the name. "Fine name. You've got good hands for someone who dresses that fancy." Draven's mouth curved, the first real smile she had seen from him. "I've had practice." She turned away before he could catch her watching, busying herself with a task that didn't need doing, because something about the easy way he'd offered his name, while she still couldn't bring herself to offer hers, sat uncomfortably in her chest. It wasn't fair, she told herself. He had nothing to lose by being known. She had everything. That evening, as the camp settled into the uneasy quiet that came after everyone had eaten what little there was to eat, she found him sitting apart from the others, near the edge of camp where the ground sloped down toward the receding floodwaters. She almost walked past without stopping. Almost. "You should rest," she said instead, coming to stand a careful distance away. "You still favor your ribs." "I'm fine." He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dark water in the distance, still glinting faintly under a sky just beginning to clear. "I keep thinking about yesterday, about how close it was. You survived. Because of you." He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression made her want to step back, to put distance between herself and whatever was building in his eyes. "I don't say that lightly. I don't forget things like that. Anyone would have done the same." "No," he said, quiet but firm. "They wouldn't have. Most people would have run for help. You didn't hesitate." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them while the last light faded from the sky. It was strange, she thought, how comfortable that silence felt, how little it demanded of her compared to every other silence she had learned to fear in her life. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. She braced herself, certain the question would circle back to her name again. "You can ask. Why do the other refugees look at you the way they do? Not unkindly, but like they're not sure whether to trust you or protect you." The question caught her off guard, more than his earlier ones had. She looked out at the water, buying herself a moment before answering. "I've been here longer than most," she said carefully. "I know how things work. People come to me when they need help navigating the camp's systems, food distribution, medical rationing, dealing with the overseers. I suppose that makes some of them wary. Depending on someone too much for too long can feel like a debt they're not sure how to repay." It was true, as far as it went, though it left out the deeper reasons. The years of careful anonymity, the way she had built herself into someone useful but forgettable, present but unremarkable. Exactly the kind of person no one thought twice about when danger came looking for names worth hunting. She had learned to be necessary without being noticed. It was the only kind of safety she had ever managed to build for herself. Draven studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he saw more in her careful answer than she had intended to show him. "You carry a lot for people who barely know your name," he said. "I don't need them to know it." "Why not?" The question landed harder than she expected, sharper somehow than his earlier asking, and she found herself answering before she'd decided to. "Because names get remembered, and remembered things get found." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than she'd intended, and she watched something shift in his expression, not confusion, but understanding, or the beginning of it, as if her answer had given him a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was assembling. "Someone's looking for you," he said, It wasn't quite a question. She stood abruptly, brushing dirt from her knees, putting an end to a conversation that had gone further than she'd meant to let it. It's late. You should sleep while you can. Tomorrow, the overseers will start their inspection rounds, and it's better if you're not standing out when they do. He let her go without pressing further, though she felt his eyes on her back the entire walk to her tent, and she told herself the warmth that thought sent through her chest was nothing more than exhaustion catching up with her at last. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind circling the conversation, replaying the careful way he had asked his questions, the way he had listened to her answers as if they mattered more than idle curiosity. She had spent years perfecting the art of being unremarkable, and in less than 2 days, this stranger had noticed more about her than most people managed in years of proximity. It frightened her, how easy it had become to talk to him. It frightened her more, how much she had wanted to keep talking. She woke the next morning to the sound of raised voices near the camp's main gate, sharp and urgent in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. She dressed quickly and pushed out of her tent to find a cluster of people gathered near the entrance, and at the center of it, unmistakable even at a distance, stood a group of armed men in fine, dark uniforms she did not recognize. Uniforms too clean, too well made, for anyone who belonged in a refugee camp. Her stomach dropped. She scanned the crowd for Draven and found him already moving toward the gate, his posture straighter than she had seen it since the flood, something in his bearing shifting into a shape she hadn't seen before. Not the quiet, careful helper who had hauled water buckets and steadied tent poles, but something else entirely. Something that made the armed men at the gate go very still the moment they saw him. "My lord," one of them said, and dropped immediately to one knee in the mud, the others following a heartbeat later. The camp went silent. Every eye turned first to the kneeling men, then to Draven, then, slowly, inevitably, to her. She felt the ground shift beneath her, in a way that had nothing to do with the flood-softened earth. "My lord," the words rang through the quiet morning air like a struck bell, and she understood, all at once, exactly what kind of mistake she had made in pulling that particular stranger from the river. Draven did not look at his men first. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that might have been an apology, or might have been the simple, unavoidable truth finally catching up to both of them. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly, just for her, though half the camp was already close enough to hear. "My name is Draven Ashcroft. I am the Alpha King of the Ashcroft territory." The words landed like another kind of flood, sweeping away the careful, fragile normalcy of the last 2 days, and leaving nothing behind but the cold, familiar fear she had spent years running from. She took a step back before she could stop herself. Around her, whispers rippled outward through the gathering crowd, faster than any flood, faster than anything she could hope to outrun. The Alpha King, here, in their camp, saved by a nameless woman none of them had ever thought twice about. She saw Edwin's face among the crowd, slack with shock. She saw the camp overseer, a hard-eyed man named Garrick who had never once bothered to learn her name despite years of her working under his authority, suddenly staring at her with an entirely new kind of attention, the kind of attention that made her skin crawl, the kind that calculated value where none had existed a moment before. Draven took a step toward her, one hand extended, not in command but in something closer to apology. "Please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, steady the way she had trained herself to sound, even when everything inside her was unraveling. "You are who you are. I am who I am. Nothing about that has changed." But she knew, even as she said it, that everything had changed. A refugee who had quietly, anonymously saved the life of the most powerful alpha in the region was no longer anonymous. She was no longer safe, in the particular, careful way she had built for herself, over years of vigilance. She turned and walked back toward her tent without waiting for his response, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind already racing through the calculations she had spent years perfecting. How fast could she pack? How far could she get before anyone noticed she was gone? Whether disappearing now would be enough to undo what had just happened in front of half the camp. Behind her, she heard Draven's voice, low and urgent, speaking to his kneeling men, though she couldn't make out the words over the roaring in her own ears. She reached her tent, ducked inside, and pressed her back against the flimsy canvas wall, breathing hard, trying to think past the panic clawing up her throat. She had spent years building a life small enough that nothing and no one could take it from her. And in less than 2 days, one flood, one stranger, one moment of instinct she couldn't have stopped herself from acting on even if she'd tried, had unraveled all of it in front of an entire camp of witnesses. Outside, she could still hear the murmur of voices, could feel the weight of 100 new eyes turned toward her tent, wondering, calculating, already reshaping their understanding of who she was. She closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe. Whatever came next, she would face it the way she had faced everything else in her life. Carefully, quietly, and completely alone, because that was the only way she had ever learned to survive. She did not leave that night, though she thought about it more than once. By the time darkness settled over Camp 7, the armed men had set up a small perimeter near the gate, careful to give the camp its space but impossible to ignore all the same. Word of what had happened traveled through every tent and cook fire before the sun had fully set, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until she barely recognized her own actions in the stories people whispered about her. She stayed inside her tent for most of the afternoon, listening to the shifting tone of the camp outside. Curiosity, awe, and beneath it, something colder that she recognized immediately, because she had spent her whole life learning to recognize it. Envy, suspicion. The particular resentment reserved for someone who had, without meaning to, become important in a world where importance was usually earned through connections none of them had. A knock, if it could be called that, came against the wooden frame of her tent's doorway, just as the light outside faded to full dark. She knew who it was before she opened the flap. Draven stood there in fresh clothes, someone from his guard clearly having brought him a change from wherever they were camped, and even dressed simply he looked entirely different from the man who had sat by her fire that morning, helping an old man patch a roof. There was an authority to him now that could not be unlearned once seen, a straightness to his shoulders that made it impossible to imagine him as merely a helpful stranger again. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't owe me anything." She kept her voice even, though her hands, hidden behind the fold of the tent flap, were not quite steady. "You never lied to me. I never asked the right questions. That's generous of you. I still should have told you the truth sooner." She studied him for a long moment before stepping back from the doorway, a silent invitation he took without hesitation, ducking into the small space and folding himself down onto the packed dirt floor with far more ease than a king should have shown for such humble surroundings. "Why didn't you?" she asked, settling across from him, keeping the distance between them deliberate. "At first, because I was too disoriented to think clearly. After that." He paused, considering his words with the same careful weight he seemed to bring to everything. "After that, because I liked being someone you didn't already have an opinion about. Every person I meet as the Alpha King already knows what to expect from me before I've said a word. You didn't know anything. You just saw someone drowning and pulled him out." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She had expected excuses, political explanations, the kind of careful diplomatic language she imagined men in his position used as easily as breathing. Instead, he had simply told her the truth, plain and a little vulnerable, in a way she hadn't expected from someone with his kind of power. "It doesn't change anything," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. "You're still the Alpha King. I'm still a refugee with no name worth remembering." Whatever this was, she gestured vaguely between them, encompassing the flood, the barn, the long walk back to camp. "It doesn't survive contact with who you actually are." "Why not?" "Because men like you don't stay in camps like this. You have a territory to run, a court waiting for you, probably a search party combing half the valley wondering if you're alive. In a day, maybe 2, you'll go back to that world, and I'll still be here, exactly where I've always been." Something flickered across his face, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. "Is that what you want? For me to leave and forget this happened?" She opened her mouth to say yes, because yes was the safe answer, the answer that kept her small and unremarkable and alive, the way she had trained herself to be for years. But the word wouldn't come. She closed her mouth again, and the silence that followed said more than she had intended it to. "I don't know what I want," she admitted finally, quieter than she meant to. "I've spent a long time making sure wanting things doesn't matter, because wanting things gets you hurt. It's easier not to. Draven watched her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made her unable to. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Before the camp, before any of this." The question sat between them like a held breath. She had told no one her history, not fully, not in years, not the overseers who processed her paperwork, not the neighbors who had shared her fire, not even Edwin, who had known her longer than most and never once pried. But something about the quiet dark of the tent, the low, steady sound of Draven's voice, the fact that he had already seen more of her true self in 2 days than most people saw in years, made the walls she had built feel, for one dangerous moment, almost worth lowering. "My pack was destroyed," she said finally, the words coming slow and careful, like stepping onto ice she wasn't sure would hold. "Years ago. I was young. I don't remember all of it. I've told myself that's a mercy, though some nights I'm not sure I believe it. I remember running. I remember not stopping for a long time. Eventually I ended up here, in a camp system built for people exactly like me. People with no home left, no family, no proof of who they used to be. I decided early on that the safest thing I could do was disappear into that. Become no one. No one worth hunting." "Hunting," Draven repeated quietly. "You think someone is still looking for you?" She met his eyes, and something in her expression must have answered the question clearly enough, because he didn't press her to say more. Instead he simply nodded, slow and grave, filing the information away the way she had watched him file away everything else since the moment they'd met. "You're safe here," he said. "Whatever happened before, whoever might still be looking, you have my protection now. That's not a small thing." "It's a dangerous thing," she corrected. "The moment anyone connects your name to mine, I stop being invisible. Invisible has kept me alive for years. You just made that a great deal harder." He absorbed the accusation without flinching, though she saw it land, saw something like guilt settle briefly across his features. "I didn't think about that. I should have." "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't have knelt your men in front of the whole camp and announced exactly who I'd been talking to for 2 days. What would you have had me do instead? Pretend I didn't know you? Let my own men treat you like a stranger after everything you did for me?" "Yes," she said, simply, and watched the word land harder than she'd expected it to. "That's exactly what I would have had you do." The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable, filled with everything neither of them knew how to say. Outside, the camp had gone mostly quiet, the low murmur of evening conversations fading into the deeper hush of night, broken only by the occasional crackle of a dying fire, or the distant call of some night bird settling into the trees beyond the floodline. "I can't undo what's already happened," Draven said finally. "But I can make sure it doesn't put you in more danger than it already has. Tell me who you're running from. Let me help you." "You don't even know my name," she said. "How do you expect to help me against an enemy I haven't described, running from a history I haven't explained?" "Then explain it," he said, quiet but steady. "I'm not asking out of curiosity. I'm asking because I intend to protect you, whether you tell me your name or not, and I'd rather do it with the full truth than half of it." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for the calculation she expected to find there. The political angle, the advantage he might be seeking, the reason a king would bother protecting a refugee he'd known for less than 3 days. She found none of it. Just the same steady, careful attention he had given her since the moment he'd woken in that barn and asked for her name. It should have made her trust him less. Instead, against every instinct she had spent years cultivating, it made her trust him more. "My pack," she said slowly, "was allied with a smaller territory, near the eastern border. There was a dispute, land, resources. I was too young to understand the details fully. Our neighbors decided the dispute was worth more than an alliance. They came at night. I don't remember much of what happened, only that I ran, and that I never stopped running long enough to find out if anyone else survived." "Do you know who led the attack?" She hesitated. This was the part she never spoke aloud, the part that had kept her silent and careful for years, because names had power, and speaking a name out loud felt like inviting its owner to hear it. "Lord Alaric Voss," she said finally, the name feeling strange and dangerous on her tongue after so many years of silence. "If he's even still alive, if he even remembers a border skirmish from years ago that likely meant nothing to him beyond an extra piece of land." Draven went very still, She watched something shift behind his eyes. Recognition. Calculation. The particular stillness of a man rearranging everything he thought he understood about the world in light of new information. "I know that name," he said quietly. "Voss sits on my council. He's one of the territories aligned with mine." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. She had spent years telling herself that distance was safety, that the border camps were far enough from the world of pack politics, that no one connected to her past would ever cross paths with her again. And here, in the space of a single sentence, that fragile safety collapsed entirely. "Then you understand," she said, her voice tightening with something between fear and resignation, "exactly why I never wanted you to know my name." Draven reached toward her then, slow enough to give her every chance to pull away, and closed his hand gently over hers where it rested against the dirt floor between them. She did not pull away, though every instinct in her screamed that she should. "I understand," he said, "that whatever happens next, you are not facing it alone anymore, whether you want that or not." She looked down at his hand covering hers, at the quiet, unshakable certainty in his voice, and felt something in her chest crack open, that she had spent years keeping carefully, deliberately sealed. It terrified her more than the flood ever had. 3 days later, Draven returned to his own court, and the moment he stepped through the gates of his territory, he understood exactly how much had changed in his absence. His advisors met him with the barely controlled panic of men who had spent days assuming their king was dead, and beneath that panic, once the initial relief passed, came the questions. Where had he been? Who had sheltered him? Why had it taken this long to send word ahead of his return? He answered as few of those questions as he could manage, offering only the broad strokes: a flood, an injury, a camp that had taken him in, until he was strong enough to travel. He did not mention the woman, not because he intended to hide her, but because something in him wanted to protect the memory of those days a little longer, before the machinery of his court got its hands on it and turned it into something political. That protection did not last long. Lady Seraphine found him within the hour, gliding into his study with the particular grace she brought to everything, her expression carefully arranged into relief that did not quite reach her eyes. She was, by every practical measure, exactly what a king in his position was supposed to want: beautiful, composed, born into a territory whose alliance strengthened his own, patient in a way that had never once felt like patience, so much as careful, calculated waiting. "We were told you might not survive," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "The relief is considerable, I assure you." "I appreciate the concern," he said, and meant it, even if the words felt strangely hollow after everything that had happened since he'd last sat in this room. "The camp that sheltered you," she said, watching him with an attention too sharp to be idle curiosity. "I understand you spent several days there, longer than the injuries alone would explain." He should have expected this. Seraphine did not miss details, and the gap between his disappearance and his return had clearly given her plenty of time to gather whatever fragments of information had made their way back to court ahead of him. "The flood damaged the roads," he said. "Travel was slower than it should have been." Of course, she let the subject rest there, though he could see, in the careful way she studied him, that she did not fully believe the explanation. "I'm told there was a woman, one of the refugees, that your men knelt to you in front of the entire camp because of her." News traveled faster than he had accounted for, evidently. He kept his expression neutral through years of practice, though something in his chest tightened at the way Seraphine said the word woman, flat and precise, already weighing its implications. "She saved my life," he said simply. "I would be dead without her. That's not something I intend to hide or apologize for." "No one is asking you to apologize," Seraphine said smoothly. "I'm simply curious what it means for someone in your position to owe that kind of debt to a nameless refugee. Her name is not the issue." "Isn't it?" Seraphine's eyes narrowed slightly, the first real crack in her careful composure. "A king with no name to attach to his rescuer is a king whose story the council will fill in however they please. Rumors are already forming, Draven. It would be far easier to control them if you gave people something solid to hold on to." He thought of the woman's face in that dim barn, the careful, guarded way she had refused to give him her name, even after everything they had survived together, the fear in her voice when she'd spoken Alaric Voss's name aloud for the first time in years. He understood, in a way Seraphine likely never would, exactly why that name mattered so much to keep hidden. "I intend to find out more about her situation," he said carefully. "Beyond that, there's nothing further to discuss." Seraphine studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not anger, not yet, but the particular calculation of someone recalculating a plan they had assumed was already secure.
"You've known her 3 days," she said. "I've known you 3 years. I would think that counts for something."
"It does," he said, because it was true, and because he had no interest in cruelty, even where cruelty might have been deserved. "This isn't a comparison, Seraphine. It's not a competition between what I owe you and what I owe her." "Isn't it?" she said again, quieter this time, and left the room without waiting for an answer. He sat alone in his study for a long time after she'd gone, turning over everything that had happened since the flood first tore through the valley. He thought about the way the woman had moved through that camp, competent and quietly essential, in ways no one seemed to fully appreciate. He thought about her hands pressing rhythm into his chest when his own lungs had forgotten how to work. He thought about the fear in her eyes when Alaric Voss's name had finally left her mouth, and the way she had flinched, just slightly, when he'd told her the man sat on his own council. He called for his chief advisor, a steady, unflappable wolf named Corwin, who had served his father before him, and gave him a task he suspected would prove more complicated than either of them yet understood. "I need everything you can find on the border conflict between the Ashcroft-aligned territories and any smaller pack destroyed near the eastern edge, roughly 20 years ago," he said. "Specifically, anything connecting Alaric Voss's territory to an attack on an allied pack." Corwin's expression sharpened with the particular focus of a man who understood immediately that this was not an idle request. "That's old history, my lord. Records from that period are incomplete at best. Most of what survived the border wars from that era was lost or deliberately destroyed." "Look anyway," Draven said, "and do it quietly. I don't want Voss aware that anyone is asking questions about that period." Corwin nodded once and left without further questions, the kind of quiet efficiency Draven had come to rely on over the years. Alone again, Draven allowed himself, for the first time since returning to his court, to fully sit with the weight of what he had learned. If the woman's story was true, and he had no reason to doubt it, not after the raw, guarded way she had told it, then a member of his own council had orchestrated the destruction of an allied territory, wiped out an entire pack, for reasons that likely amounted to nothing more than greed, and had spent years sitting in meetings beside Draven's own advisors, as though nothing had happened at all. And somewhere in a border refugee camp, the last surviving thread of that destroyed pack was living under an assumed anonymity, so complete that even her own name had become a weapon she couldn't afford to use. He thought of his promise to her, that she would not face whatever came next alone, and understood, with a clarity that settled deep into his chest, exactly how much that promise was going to cost him to keep. Over the following days, he found himself returning to thoughts of her more often than he cared to admit even to himself. In council meetings, discussing trade routes and border repairs necessitated by the flood, some part of his mind would drift back to the barn, to the particular way she had refused his help with her injuries, even as she tended to his own without hesitation. In quiet moments alone, he found himself remembering the sound of her voice when she'd finally admitted, in the dark of her tent, that she didn't know what she wanted anymore, because wanting things had never once been safe for her. He arranged, quietly, for supplies to be sent to Camp 7, food, medicine, materials to help rebuild what the flood had damaged. He instructed Corwin to route the aid in a way that would not draw attention to its origin, not wanting to make her situation more precarious than his own careless honesty already had. It was not enough. He knew that even as he arranged it, but it was what he could do without revealing more than she was ready for him to reveal, and for now, it would have to be a start. Seraphine watched all of it with the sharp, careful attention of a woman who understood, long before Draven fully admitted it to himself, exactly what was happening to the careful arrangement she had spent years assuming would eventually become her future. She said nothing more about it, for the moment, but she began, quietly, to make inquiries of her own, about the camp, about the woman, about exactly what kind of threat a nameless refugee might pose to a plan she had invested far too much in to simply watch collapse. Neither Draven nor the woman he had left behind in that flood-damaged camp yet understood how many people had already begun paying attention to a story that had started, simply enough, with a single act of instinct in a rising river. It would not stay simple for long. Life in Camp 7 did not pause for anyone, not even for a woman who had unknowingly become the center of court gossip 200 miles away. The days after Draven's departure fell back into their old rhythm, though nothing about the camp felt quite the same. She noticed it in small ways at first. Extra rations appearing at her tent without explanation, materials for rebuilding the storm-damaged shelters arriving faster than the camp had ever seen supplies move before. The overseer Garrick suddenly, uncomfortably polite to her, in a way he had never bothered to be in, all the years she had lived under his authority. She understood immediately where the changes had come from, and she hated how much it unsettled her to be noticed this way, even from a distance. "You've gone and made yourself important," Edwin said one afternoon, watching her sort through a crate of new tools that had arrived that morning with no note, no explanation, just quiet efficiency that could only have come from someone with resources far beyond anything the camp normally saw. "Not sure that's a compliment where we come from." "It's not what I wanted," she said, and meant it completely. "Doesn't much matter what you wanted, does it? Wanting things and getting them don't usually travel together." Edwin's eyes crinkled with the particular understanding of someone who had lived long enough to know exactly how little control any of them had over the things that happened to them. "For what it's worth, girl, I don't think less of you for it. Man like that doesn't waste effort on people who don't deserve it." She didn't answer, because she didn't trust her voice to stay steady if she tried. The camp's population noticed the changes too, and their reactions split along familiar lines. Some were grateful, simply glad for supplies that made survival marginally less desperate, uninterested in the politics behind their arrival. Others watched her with a new wariness, a calculation in their eyes that hadn't been there before, as if trying to determine what her sudden, unwanted importance might mean for their own position in the camp's fragile hierarchy. Garrick's shift in behavior bothered her most of all. The overseer had never been cruel exactly, but he had certainly never been kind, treating the camp's residents as numbers to be managed, rather than people to be helped. His newfound deference, the careful way he now addressed her, the small favors he began offering unprompted, felt less like respect and more like a man recalculating exactly how much value she might now hold, and what that value might be worth to someone in the right position to exploit it. She kept her guard up around him more than ever, and it was that instinct, sharpened by years of careful observation, that made her notice when a stranger arrived at the camp gates, roughly a week after Draven's departure. He did not look like the flood relief workers who had begun trickling through the camp with supplies. He wore fine traveling clothes, similar in quality to what Draven had worn the day she'd pulled him from the river, and he carried himself with the same unmistakable weight of someone accustomed to authority. But where Draven's presence had felt, even from the first confused moment in the barn, oddly grounded and careful, this stranger's presence felt sharp in a way that immediately raised every warning instinct she had. She watched from a distance as he spoke with Garrick near the camp gates, watched the overseer's posture shift into the particular deference reserved for someone with real power, watched the stranger's eyes move slowly across the camp, cataloging, assessing, searching. She did not need to hear the conversation to understand, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that this man was looking for something, or someone. She retreated to the far side of the camp, using the maze of tents and makeshift shelters to put distance and cover between herself and the gate, forcing herself to breathe slowly, despite the panic clawing up her throat. It could be nothing. It could be another Ashcroft representative, another relief coordinator, another routine visitor drawn by the flood's aftermath and nothing more. But the careful, cautious part of her mind that had kept her alive for years refused to believe that, and she had learned long ago never to argue with that particular instinct. She spent the rest of the day working at the far edges of the camp, keeping her movements small and unremarkable, watching from a careful distance as the stranger moved slowly through the tents, speaking with residents, asking questions she couldn't hear, but could imagine all too well. By evening, he had not approached her directly, and she allowed herself the smallest measure of relief, though it did nothing to fully loosen the tension coiled through her shoulders. That relief did not last. Edwin found her just after dark, his expression tight with a concern that immediately sharpened her own fear into something closer to certainty. "That fella at the gate," he said without preamble. asking questions about a woman fitting your description. Says he's compiling records for the Crown, cross-referencing refugee identities against old territorial registries. Something about verifying claims for relief distribution. That's not what he's here for, she said quietly. No, Edwin agreed. Didn't figure it was. She spent that night awake, turning over her options with the same careful precision she had used to survive every crisis in her life since the night her pack had burned. She could run, disappear before morning, put distance between herself and whatever danger this stranger represented, start over somewhere new, the way she had started over so many times before. It would be the safest choice. It would also mean leaving behind the fragile, unwanted connection she had built with Draven, the small, dangerous hope that had begun growing in her chest, despite every instinct telling her not to trust it. She thought about Alaric Voss, about the fear that still lived in her chest whenever she allowed herself to remember the night her pack had died, about the possibility that this stranger might be connected to that history in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. By morning, she had made her decision. She would not run, not yet. Running had kept her alive for years, but it had also kept her small, hidden, unable to ever truly settle anywhere, long enough to build something real. For the first time in longer than she could remember, something in her life felt worth staying to protect, even at the cost of the safety her anonymity had always provided. She approached the stranger directly the following afternoon, choosing a moment when the camp was busy enough that their conversation would draw minimal attention, but public enough that she would not be caught alone with him if her instincts about his intentions proved correct. "I understand you're looking for someone," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. The stranger turned to study her, with an unhurried attention that confirmed every fear she'd carried through the sleepless night. "I'm compiling records," he said, echoing the explanation Edwin had relayed, though his eyes moved over her with a scrutiny that had nothing to do with routine paperwork. "For relief distribution purposes. You'll forgive me if I don't believe that." Something flickered across his face, not surprise, but a kind of sharpened interest, as if her directness had confirmed something he'd suspected. "You're quicker than most people in this camp," he said. "That tracks with what I've heard." "Heard from where?" "From people who noticed a certain visitor's particular attachment to a woman he refused to name, even to his own counsel." The stranger's smile did not reach his eyes. "My name is Alaric Voss. I sit on King Ashcroft's council. I understand you, and I may have a great deal of shared history." The world seemed to narrow around her, every sound in the camp fading beneath the roar of her own pulse. She had spent years imagining this moment, had rehearsed 100 versions of what she might say or do if this exact confrontation ever came, and now that it had finally arrived, every rehearsed response deserted her completely. "I don't know what you're talking about," she managed, though her voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. "Don't you?" Voss studied her with an intensity that felt like being dissected. "There was a pack, years ago, near the eastern border, a small territory, aligned with mine at the time, that suffered a terrible tragedy. I've always understood there were no survivors. It would be remarkable, wouldn't it, to learn otherwise, after all this time." She said nothing, because anything she said would either confirm what he already clearly suspected, or reveal how thoroughly he had already pieced the truth together without her help. "I mean you no harm," Voss said, his voice softening into something that felt, to her ears, far more dangerous than any open threat could have been. "I simply believe old history deserves to stay buried where it belongs, for everyone's sake, yours especially." The warning beneath his polite words was unmistakable, and she felt it settle into her chest with the same cold certainty she had carried since childhood, the understanding that some dangers did not announce themselves with violence, but with quiet, careful conversations exactly like this one. "I have work to do," she said, and turned to walk away, before he could see how badly her hands had begun to shake. Behind her, Voss did not call her back, did not press further, simply watched her go with the patient, unhurried attention of a man, entirely confident that he had already said everything necessary to make his point clear. She did not sleep at all that night, and by the time dawn broke over the camp, she understood, with the same cold clarity that had once told her to run from a burning pack territory years ago, that the fragile safety she had built for herself had already begun collapsing, piece by piece, faster than she could hope to rebuild it. Whatever came next, she would need help facing it. and there was only one person she could think of who might actually be able to provide it. Word reached Draven 3 days later, carried by a quiet messenger who had traveled through the night to deliver it. A short, carefully worded letter, unsigned, describing a visit from a council member, asking pointed questions about old border histories. She had not written her name at the bottom. She hadn't needed to. He read it twice in his study, before calling Corwin in, his jaw tight with an anger he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. Voss went to the camp himself, he said, sliding the letter across the desk. Days after I asked you to look quietly into the border conflict. That's not a coincidence. Corwin read the letter carefully, his expression darkening as he reached the end. Someone in the records office may have mentioned the inquiry, he said. Or Voss has his own sources watching for exactly this kind of question. Either way, my lord, he knows you're looking into something, and he's decided to look into it himself before you can. Which means he knows about her. It would seem so. Draven stood, pacing the length of his study with the restless energy of a man who wanted, more than anything, to simply ride to Camp 7 himself and remove the threat with his own hands. But he understood, even through the anger, that recklessness would only make her situation more dangerous, not less. A king openly confronting a council member over unverified accusations, based on a refugee's unproven claims, would create exactly the kind of political chaos Voss could use to discredit both of them, before any real evidence came to light. What have you found? He asked instead, forcing his voice back into something steadier. About the attack. Corwin hesitated, the particular hesitation of a man delivering news he knew would not be welcome. Fragments, he said, enough to raise questions, not enough to prove anything conclusively. There are records of a border dispute between Voss's territory and a smaller allied pack roughly the right number of years ago. The official record states the smaller pack was destroyed by an unaffiliated raiding group, and that Voss's territory absorbed the abandoned land afterward through standard succession procedure. You don't believe that? I believe the timing is convenient, Corwin said carefully, and I believe a woman who survived that exact attack, hiding under complete anonymity, for years out of genuine fear, is not the kind of testimony that emerges from nothing. But belief and proof are different things, my lord. If we move against a sitting council member without solid evidence, we risk destabilizing the entire alliance structure your father spent decades building. Draven understood the weight of that warning better than he wanted to. His father had spent years carefully knitting together a network of allied territories, and Voss's own lands sat at a strategic border point that made his cooperation valuable regardless of what he might have done years ago to secure it. Moving against him carelessly could fracture alliances that had taken generations to build, could leave his own territory more vulnerable to exactly the kind of external threats those alliances existed to prevent. But he thought of her face, in the dim light of that tent, the raw fear in her voice, when she'd finally spoken Voss's name aloud, the years of careful, exhausting anonymity she had built for herself, simply to survive a danger no one else had believed worth investigating. He could not, in good conscience, weigh political stability against her safety and decide the stability mattered more. Find the proof, he said, whatever it takes. Dig into the estate records, the succession paperwork, anything that might reveal how Voss's territory actually gained that land. And do it faster than before. She doesn't have the luxury of time while we move carefully. Corwin nodded, though his expression remained troubled. And in the meantime, my lord, Voss has already made his interest in her known. If he decides the fastest way to protect his own history is to eliminate the one person who could expose it. I know, Draven said, cutting him off before the sentence could finish, because he had already spent every waking hour since reading her letter, turning over exactly that possibility. That's why I'm going back. My lord, if you're seen showing this kind of attention to a single refugee, especially now that Voss is already watching, then let him watch, Draven said. I'm not interested in hiding this, Corwin. I already tried that once, and it only made things worse. If Voss wants to see exactly how much I care about her safety, he can see it plainly. He left within the hour, taking a small enough escort to travel quickly without drawing the kind of formal attention that would slow him down at every border checkpoint. The ride to Camp 7 felt longer than it had any right to, his mind circling through every possible scenario Voss's visit might have set into motion, every way this could go wrong before he arrived. He reached the camp as evening settled over the valley, the flood damage from weeks earlier still visible in the scarred landscape surrounding the tents, though the rebuilding efforts had clearly made progress in his absence. He found her near the edge of camp, exactly where he had first spoken with her the night after the flood, and something in his chest loosened at the simple, uncomplicated relief of seeing her alive and unharmed. She turned at the sound of his approach, and whatever guarded composure she had maintained since sending the letter cracked slightly at the sight of him, relief and frustration mixing openly across her features. "You shouldn't have come," she said, though there was no real conviction behind the words. "If Voss is watching you, let him watch," Draven said, echoing what he'd told Corwin, and closed the remaining distance between them before he could stop himself, before either of them could decide it was wiser to keep the careful space they'd maintained since his last visit. She did not step back. "He knows," she said quietly, once they'd settled near the same dying fire where they'd first spoken openly to each other. "Or he suspects enough to be dangerous either way. He came here himself, Draven. He looked at me like he already knew exactly who I was." "I know, I got your letter." He studied her face in the firelight, taking in the exhaustion shadowing her eyes, the tightness in her shoulders that told him she hadn't slept properly since Voss's visit. "I have people looking into the records from that period. It's slow. Careful work, because moving too fast without proof could make things worse for both of us. But we will find something. And if you don't? If there's nothing left to find, because he was thorough enough years ago to erase whatever might have proven what he did." The fear in her voice was raw and immediate, and he understood, watching her, that this was not simply about proving a decades-old crime. This was about a woman who had spent her entire adult life running from a danger everyone else had assumed was long buried, finally forced to confront the possibility that the danger had never actually gone away at all. "Then we find another way," he said, reaching for her hand the way he had in her tent weeks earlier. And this time she did not hesitate before letting him take it. "I am not going to let him hurt you. Whatever it takes. Whatever it costs politically. That matters more to me than any alliance he represents." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face with the same careful scrutiny she brought to everything, as if trying to determine whether his certainty was real, or simply the kind of easy promise powerful men made, without fully understanding what it might cost to keep. "You don't even know my name," she said finally, though the words carried none of the sharp deflection they once had. This time they sounded almost like an offering. "No," he agreed, "but I know you. I've known you since the moment you dragged me out of that river without a second thought for your own safety. Whatever name you carry, it doesn't change who you actually are, and it never has." Something shifted in her expression, a wall finally beginning to crack after weeks of careful defense, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked, in the firelight, less like a woman braced for the worst, and more like someone daring, cautiously, to hope for something better instead. "Lyra," she said quietly, so quietly he almost missed it beneath the crackle of the fire. "My name is Lyra Vane." He held her gaze steadily, understanding immediately the weight of what she had just given him, not simply a name, but years of carefully guarded trust, finally, cautiously extended to someone she had decided, against every hard-earned instinct, was worth the risk. "Lyra," he repeated, testing the shape of it, watching something ease in her shoulders, at hearing it spoken aloud by someone who finally knew the truth behind it. "Thank you for trusting me with that." She did not answer, but she did not pull her hand from his either, and they sat together by the fire, as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who had begun, slowly and against every reasonable caution either of them possessed, to build something neither of them yet fully understood how to protect. Somewhere beyond the camp's boundaries, in a court 200 miles away, Alaric Voss was already making plans of his own, and Lady Seraphine, watching the growing distance between herself and the future she had once considered secure, had begun quietly reaching out to allies of her own. The fragile peace by the fire would not last much longer, but for one evening at least, it was enough. Corwin's search for proof moved faster once Draven returned to court with new urgency behind every instruction he gave. Within 2 weeks, the quiet investigation had uncovered enough fragments to build a picture, even if the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. Old shipping manifests showed unusual movements of Voss's forces in the months surrounding the attack. A retired border guard, tracked down after years of quiet retirement in a distant territory, remembered rumors from that period. soldiers under Voss's banner spotted near the destroyed pack's territory, days before the attack occurred. Rumors that had been quickly suppressed at the time by officials no longer in any position to explain themselves. None of it constituted proof a formal council tribunal would accept without question. All of it, taken together, painted a picture that made Draven's stomach turn every time he reviewed the growing file Corwin had assembled. Draven brought Lyra into the process as much as he could without drawing further attention to her situation, sending trusted messengers back and forth between the court and Camp 7, with careful updates, always mindful that Voss might still have eyes watching the camp for any sign of the investigation closing in. It was during one of these careful exchanges, nearly a month after the flood had first thrown their paths together, that Lyra herself provided the piece that finally shifted everything. She had been recruited, by Draven's quiet arrangement, to assist with the ongoing relief coordination between Camp 7 and the neighboring territories, still recovering from the flood's damage. It gave her a legitimate reason to travel occasionally beyond the camp's boundaries, meeting with officials and coordinators in ways that no longer looked suspicious even under Voss's watchful attention. It was during one such meeting, reviewing old territorial boundary records to help resolve a rebuilding dispute between two neighboring relief zones, that she found it. An old land deed, buried in an archive that had nothing directly to do with her own history, listing the transfer of a small eastern territory into Voss's holdings. The date matched. The description of the land matched the boundaries she remembered, hazy and fragmented, from a childhood she had spent years trying not to think about. But it was the signature at the bottom that made her hands go cold as she read it, not an official transfer document processed through the proper channels of succession law, but a personal seal, Voss's own mark, applied to a document that predated the official record of the attack by nearly a full week. He had claimed the land before the attack had officially happened, before anyone was supposed to know that a pack had been destroyed at all. She brought the document to Draven herself, traveling the full distance to his court for the first time since the flood, her hand still trembling slightly as she laid it on his desk. "This proves it," she said, watching him study the document with growing recognition of exactly what it meant. He knew what was going to happen. He signed for the land before it was even supposed to be available. Draven read the document twice, his expression darkening with each pass. "This is exactly the kind of evidence Corwin has been searching for," he said. "A dated seal that predates the official incident report. No innocent explanation accounts for that. What happens now?" "Now," Draven said, setting the document down carefully, as if it might shatter under too much pressure. "I bring this before the full council. Formally. With this evidence, along with everything Corwin has already gathered, there's enough to demand a full investigation into Voss's conduct. He'll deny it. He can deny it all he likes. Denial doesn't survive contact with a dated seal on a land transfer document that predates the official record by a week. Even his own allies on the council will struggle to explain that away." Lyra sat across from him, watching the weight of years finally beginning to lift from her shoulders, though the fear had not fully disappeared, replaced instead by something more immediate and uncertain. The knowledge that confronting Voss directly would bring its own dangers, dangers a man like him would not accept quietly. "He won't just let this happen," she said. "A man who orchestrated the destruction of an entire pack, to claim their land, isn't going to sit quietly through a council hearing and accept the consequences." "No," Draven agreed. "He won't. Which is why we need to move carefully and quickly, before he has time to prepare a defense, or, worse, decide that removing the evidence entirely is simpler than defending against it." The urgency in his voice settled a new kind of fear into her chest, sharper than the years of vague, unfocused dread she had carried for so long. This was no longer about staying hidden, about surviving quietly at the edges of a world that had already taken everything from her once. This was about confronting the man responsible directly, with consequences that could unfold in either direction, depending on how carefully the next few weeks were handled. Draven called the council session for the following week, giving Corwin just enough time to secure additional corroborating testimony from the retired border guard, and to formally authenticate the land deed through the proper archival channels. Lyra remained at court during that time, officially under the pretense of continued relief coordination work, though everyone who mattered understood, by then, that her presence meant something far more significant. Seraphine watched the preparations with an expression that grew increasingly difficult to read as the days passed, her earlier sharp jealousy tempering into something more complicated, once the true stakes of the situation became clear even to her. Whatever resentment she had carried toward Lyra's unexpected place in Draven's attention, she was not so foolish as to defend a man credibly accused of destroying an entire pack for territorial gain, not when her own family's alliance with the crown depended on maintaining a reputation for justice and stability. The night before the council session, Lyra found herself unable to sleep, pacing the small guest chamber Draven had arranged for her within the castle, her mind circling endlessly through every possible way the following day could unfold. Draven found her there near midnight, having clearly anticipated exactly the sleeplessness she was fighting. He did not ask permission before entering, simply crossed the room and settled into the chair near the window, watching her pace with the same quiet patience he had shown her since the moment they'd first spoken in that flood-damaged barn. "You don't have to attend tomorrow," he said. "If it's too much, if you'd rather I handle this without forcing you to stand in front of the council and relive everything." "I want to be there," she said, stopping her pacing to face him directly. "I've spent years being invisible, being careful, being no one worth noticing. Tomorrow, for the first time, I have the chance to stand in front of the people who let this happen, and make them see me. All of me. I'm not going to waste that chance hiding in a guest chamber because it's easier." Something in his expression shifted, pride, and something warmer, mixing together, as he studied her in the dim candlelight. "You've changed," he said quietly. "Since the flood. I don't mean that as criticism. I mean it as—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I mean it as something I've watched happen, and something I think you should be proud of." "I don't feel changed," she admitted. "I feel terrified." Terrified and changed aren't mutually exclusive. He stood, closing the distance between them, and for a moment neither of them moved, simply standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating between them, close enough that the careful distance they had maintained for weeks suddenly felt impossibly difficult to hold on to. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "you will not face it alone. I promised you that in the flood, and I meant it then just as much as I mean it now." She looked up at him, at the steady certainty in his eyes that had never once wavered since the day she'd pulled him from the river, and felt something in her chest finally settle into place, after years of careful, guarded distance from everyone and everything around her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me as more than the danger following me." "I've never seen you as anything less than remarkable," he said, and the words hung in the quiet room between them, honest and unguarded, in a way neither of them had allowed themselves to be before. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance that night, though both of them understood, standing there in the candlelight, that whatever waited for them beyond tomorrow's council session, the careful walls that had once kept them apart had already, quietly and irrevocably, begun to fall. The council chamber was full by the time Draven took his seat at its head, every territorial representative present, drawn by rumors that had spread through the court over the preceding week, despite everyone's best efforts to keep the details contained until the formal session began. Lyra stood near the side of the chamber, dressed simply, but deliberately, in clothes that made no attempt to disguise where she had come from. Her chin held level, despite the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes turning toward her the moment she entered. She had decided, in the sleepless hours before dawn, that she would not shrink from this moment, whatever it cost her. Alaric Voss sat among the other council members, his expression carefully composed, though she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the too careful stillness of a man who suspected exactly what this session had been called to address. Draven opened the proceedings without preamble, laying out the evidence Corwin had spent weeks assembling, with the same measured, deliberate calm he brought to every formal court matter, though Lyra could hear, beneath the careful neutrality of his voice, the barely contained anger that had been building in him since the night she'd first spoken Voss's name aloud in that dim tent. "Nearly 2 decades ago," Draven said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, "an allied territory near our eastern border was destroyed, in what official records describe as an unaffiliated raid. New evidence suggests that description was false, and that the destruction of that territory was in fact orchestrated to benefit a member of this very council." The chamber erupted into murmurs, quickly silenced, as Draven raised a hand for continued attention. He presented the evidence methodically, the shipping manifests showing unusual troop movements, the retired border guard's sworn testimony, and finally, the land deed itself, its dated seal, displayed for the full council to examine. Voss rose to his feet before Draven had finished speaking, his composure cracking for the first time. "This is absurd," he said, his voice carrying the particular sharpness of a man cornered and refusing to accept it. "A dated seal proves nothing beyond administrative timing. Records from that period were notoriously disorganized. I would remind this council that accusations built on fragments and rumors from a discredited border guard hardly constitute proof of the serious crime being suggested here." "Then perhaps," Draven said, his voice remaining level despite the challenge, "you would care to explain how you came to possess a signed claim to that territory, a full week before the attack that supposedly made it available was even reported to have occurred." Voss's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly toward Lyra, before returning to Draven, calculating, searching for an angle that might still salvage the situation. "Administrative errors happen," he said, though the conviction had noticeably drained from his voice. "This entire proceeding rests on the word of a refugee, with every reason to fabricate a grievance against a powerful territory. Has anyone considered that possibility? That this woman, whoever she truly is, may simply be seeking to extract advantage from her proximity to the crown?" The accusation landed like a slap, and Lyra felt every eye in the chamber shift toward her, weighing, judging, deciding whether Voss's desperate counterattack held any merit. She felt the old instinct rise in her chest, the urge to shrink back, to disappear, the way she had trained herself to disappear for years, whenever attention turned dangerous. She did not shrink back. "My name," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite the tremor she fought to control, "is Lyra Vane. I was a child when Lord Voss's forces destroyed my pack. I have spent every year since hiding my identity because I understood, even as a child too young to fully process what had happened, that whoever had done this would not hesitate to finish what they started, if they ever learned I had survived." The chamber had gone completely silent, every eye fixed on her now, and she made herself continue, despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I gained nothing from meeting King Ashcroft," she continued. "I did not know who he was when I pulled him from the flood. I did not seek proximity to the crown, and I certainly did not fabricate a childhood trauma for personal advantage. I have spent years wishing I could forget what happened to my family, rather than use it. The only reason I am standing here now is because Lord Voss himself came to my camp weeks ago and threatened me, quietly, carefully, in exactly the way a man confident in his own impunity threatens someone he assumes has no power to fight back." A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled council members, several exchanging glances that suggested Voss's reputation for careful, veiled intimidation was not entirely unfamiliar to them. Voss himself had gone pale, his earlier composure entirely abandoned as he realized the ground shifting beneath him. "This is a coordinated fabrication," he said, though his voice had lost the confident edge it carried moments earlier. "The king's evident personal attachment to this woman compromises the objectivity of this entire proceeding." "My personal feelings," Draven said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that silenced the murmuring immediately, "have nothing to do with dated seals or shipping manifests. The evidence stands on its own merit, and I invite this council to examine it independently, rather than accepting either my word or Lord Voss's denial without scrutiny." The debate that followed stretched for nearly 2 hours, council members examining the evidence in turn, questioning both Draven and Voss directly, weighing testimony that had taken weeks to assemble against decades of assumed history that Voss's territory had built its standing upon. Lyra remained standing through all of it, her legs aching, her voice hoarse from answering the careful, probing questions several council members directed at her, but she did not waver, did not retreat into the careful invisibility that had protected her for so long. In the end, it was the retired border guard's testimony, delivered in person after Corwin had arranged for his careful, secure transport to the capital, that tipped the balance decisively. The old wolf, well into his later years but sharp in memory and steady in delivery, described in specific detail the troop movements he had witnessed decades earlier, movements he had reported at the time, only to have his reports quietly buried by officials loyal to Voss's growing influence. "I've carried that memory for 20 years, the old guard said, his voice thick with the particular weight of long-suppressed guilt. I always suspected what really happened. I never had the courage or the standing to say so until now. I'm sorry it took this long. By the time the council finally called for a vote on whether to formally strip Voss of his territorial standing, pending a full criminal investigation, the outcome was no longer genuinely in question. The vote passed by an overwhelming majority. Several council members who had once counted themselves among Voss's allies, distancing themselves visibly the moment the evidence became undeniable. Voss was escorted from the chamber under guard, his protests growing increasingly desperate as the reality of his situation finally settled in, his careful decades of accumulated power collapsing in the span of a single afternoon. Lyra watched him go with an emotion she had not expected to feel after so many years of anticipating this exact confrontation. Not triumph, not even simple relief, but something quieter and more complicated. A grief for the family she had lost that no amount of justice could fully repay, mixed with a fragile, tentative sense that perhaps, finally, she could stop running. Draven found her afterward in a quiet antechamber, away from the departing crowd of council members still murmuring over the day's dramatic proceedings. He did not say anything at first, simply crossed the room and pulled her into an embrace that she sank into without hesitation, years of carefully maintained distance finally, completely dissolving. "It's over," he said quietly against her hair. "Whatever comes next, that specific danger is over." "I know," she said, though her voice carried the particular unsteadiness of someone still processing something too large to fully absorb all at once. "I don't know how to feel about it. I spent so long being afraid of this exact confrontation, and now that it's happened, I don't know what to do with myself." "You don't have to know yet," he said. "You have time now. That's what today actually bought you. Time to figure out what comes next. Without running. Without hiding." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, searching his face in the quiet room, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. Not the sharp, immediate relief of surviving another crisis, but something steadier, something that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of actual peace. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for fighting for this, even when it would have been easier not to. There was never a version of this where I didn't fight for you," Draven said, "not from the moment you pulled me out of that river." Outside the antechamber, the court continued its restless movement, council members already dispersing to spread news of the dramatic session throughout the wider territory, alliances quietly recalculating in the wake of Voss's sudden fall. But within the quiet room, for a few precious moments, none of that mattered as much as the simple, hard-won relief of two people who had finally, after everything, found solid ground to stand on together. The weeks that followed Voss's removal from the council brought a strange, unsteady kind of calm to the court, though calm, Lyra quickly learned, rarely lasted long in a world built on shifting alliances and careful political maneuvering. She remained at the castle at Draven's invitation, officially continuing her relief coordination work, while quietly, gradually, becoming someone the court could no longer ignore or dismiss. Servants who had once looked past her now greeted her by name. Council members who had watched her testimony with skeptical caution now sought her opinion on matters related to the Eastern Territories, recognizing, however grudgingly, that her first-hand knowledge of the border regions carried a value few others in the court could offer. Seraphine's attitude toward her shifted slowly over those weeks, moving from careful hostility into something more complicated, and, eventually, into a kind of wary respect that neither woman fully articulated, but both quietly understood. It was Seraphine, in fact, who approached Lyra directly one afternoon in the castle gardens, her usual composed elegance carrying a slight edge of something that might have been sincerity. "I owe you an apology," Seraphine said, settling onto a stone bench without waiting for invitation. "I spent weeks assuming you were some kind of opportunist, using proximity to the king for advantage you hadn't earned. Watching you stand in that council chamber and speak your truth in front of people who could have destroyed you for it. That wasn't the behavior of someone seeking advantage. That was courage." "I appreciate you saying that," Lyra said carefully, still uncertain how much trust to extend toward a woman who had, until recently, viewed her as a direct threat. "I won't pretend I'm not disappointed," Seraphine continued, her honesty carrying its own kind of dignity. "I had assumed, for years, that my future was settled. Watching that assumption unravel hasn't been easy. But I'm not so small a person that I'll begrudge Draven happiness simply because it didn't come in the shape I expected. The conversation that followed was not warm, exactly, but it was honest in a way Lyra had not anticipated, and by the time Seraphine rose to leave, something had shifted between them that felt, if not quite friendship, at least like the possibility of eventual mutual respect. It was not everyone at court who accepted the changing situation so gracefully. Word of Voss's fall had spread quickly beyond the immediate court, and while most territories accepted the council's decision without protest, a small faction of Voss's former allies began, quietly and carefully, to organize resistance. They understood that an open challenge to Draven's leadership would fail outright, but they calculated, correctly, that undermining Lyra's credibility and safety might achieve similar goals through less direct means. The first sign of trouble came in the form of rumors, deliberately spread through the lower levels of court society. Whispers that Lyra's testimony had been coached, that her identity as Voss's victim was itself a fabrication designed to secure her position at court, that the entire dramatic council session had been orchestrated for reasons far more calculated than simple justice. Draven moved quickly to counter the rumors, but the damage, however unfounded, had already begun to spread by the time Corwin brought the situation to his full attention. It's not enough to simply deny the rumors, Corwin advised, his expression grave as he laid out the political landscape for Draven's consideration. Voss's allies are patient. They understand that undermining Lyra's position slowly, through doubt and suspicion, achieves the same goal as an open attack, without the same risk of direct consequence. What do you suggest? Draven asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer his advisor was building toward. A formal announcement, Corwin said carefully, one that leaves no ambiguity about her standing, or your intentions toward her. Whispers are far harder to sustain against a clear, public commitment that the crown itself stands fully behind. Draven considered this for a long moment, understanding fully what Corwin was suggesting, without either of them needing to state it outright. He had known, in the quiet weeks since Voss's fall, that his feelings toward Lyra had grown into something far beyond simple gratitude or obligation. He had simply not yet found the right moment to voice it, uncertain whether she was ready to hear it, uncertain whether the timing would feel like genuine choice, or simply another political necessity forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. He found her that evening in the castle library, poring over old maps of the Eastern Territories with the same careful focus she brought to everything, and something in the quiet, ordinary domesticity of the moment made his decision feel suddenly, simply clear. I need to ask you something, he said, settling into the chair across from her, and I need you to answer honestly, without worrying about what the court expects, or what might be politically convenient. She looked up from the maps, immediately alert to the seriousness in his tone. What is it? There are rumors circulating, questioning your testimony, your identity, your reasons for being here. Corwin believes the cleanest way to counter them is a formal announcement of our relationship, something that leaves no room for doubt about where you stand. He paused, watching her expression carefully. But I don't want you to agree to that because it's politically useful. I want to know, honestly, whether it's something you actually want. Lyra set down the map she had been studying, giving him her full attention, and he watched her consider the question with the same careful weight she brought to every decision that mattered. Are you asking me to marry you? She said slowly. Or are you asking me whether I want people to stop questioning my right to exist in this world? Both, I suppose, he admitted, though the second question matters far less to me than the first. I don't care what the court believes about your right to be here. I care whether you actually want to build a life with me, beyond the politics, beyond the danger we've already survived together. She was quiet for a long moment, and he made himself wait, resisting the urge to fill the silence with reassurances or justifications, understanding that this decision needed to be entirely hers to make. I spent years, she said finally, convincing myself that wanting things, especially wanting people, was a danger I couldn't afford. Every time I let myself care about someone, I found a way to disappear before that caring could be used against me. It kept me alive. It also kept me alone, in every way that actually mattered. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, the same simple gesture that had first begun dissolving the careful distance between them weeks earlier in that dim tent by the fire. I don't want to disappear anymore, she said. Not from this. Not from you. The words settled into his chest with a warmth that outshone every careful political calculation Corwin had walked him through that afternoon, and he understood, watching her face in the soft evening light of the library, that whatever came next, the choice they were making had nothing to do with rumors or council politics, and everything to do with two people who had found, against every reasonable expectation, exactly what they had not known they were looking for. Then let's stop hiding, he said, both of us. Whatever comes next, we face it together, in front of anyone who wants to watch. She smiled, the first fully unguarded smile he had seen from her since the day she'd pulled him from the flood, and something in that simple expression felt more significant than any formal council announcement could ever hope to be. The whispers at court did not stop overnight, and Voss's remaining allies did not abandon their quiet campaign, simply because the couple at its center had found their own resolve. But standing together, hand in hand, in the quiet library that evening, neither Draven nor Lyra felt the old fear that had once kept them both so carefully guarded against exactly this kind of vulnerable, uncertain hope. Whatever remained to be faced, they would face it as they had faced the flood itself, together and without hesitation. The formal announcement came 3 weeks later, delivered not through a quiet council session, but through a public gathering held at the very levee where the flood had first torn through the valley months earlier. Draven had chosen the location deliberately, understanding that the story people would remember, the story that would silence every remaining whisper of doubt more effectively than any political maneuvering Corwin could arrange, was the truth of how it had all actually begun, not with political calculation, not with careful court arrangement, with a nameless refugee diving into a raging flood to save a drowning stranger, expecting nothing in return. The rebuilt levee stood strong and solid against the valley below, the physical wound the flood had left behind, now fully repaired, and the gathered crowd stretched further than either Draven or Lyra had anticipated, representatives from every allied territory, ordinary citizens from the surrounding lands, and, standing near the front with Edwin and several others she recognized from Camp 7, the very refugees who had once watched her disappear into anonymity every single day for years, without ever fully understanding who she truly was. Lyra stood beside Draven on a raised platform overlooking the repaired levee, dressed simply, but with a quiet dignity that needed no elaborate finery to command the attention of everyone gathered below. She had insisted on that simplicity, refusing the elaborate court dress Seraphine had gently suggested might better suit the occasion, wanting instead to stand before this crowd exactly as she had stood before the council weeks earlier, as herself, without pretense, without hiding behind anything but the truth of who she actually was. Draven began speaking once the crowd had settled, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered valley, with the same steady authority she had come to recognize as entirely genuine, never performed for effect. Months ago, he said, this valley nearly took my life. I was pulled from that flood by a woman who owed me nothing, who had every reason to protect herself instead of risking her own life for a stranger, and who chose, in that critical moment, to act anyway. I did not know, at the time, who she truly was. I know now, with complete certainty, exactly what kind of person she is, and I intend to spend the rest of my life grateful that the flood brought us together. He turned to look at her, and something in his expression carried a vulnerability she had rarely seen him show so openly in front of others. Lyra Vane survived the destruction of her own pack as a child, hid her identity for years, out of necessity rather than shame, and stood before this territory's full council weeks ago to help expose a crime that had gone unpunished for far too long. She is not simply a refugee who happened to save a king. She is the bravest, most capable person I have ever known, and I am asking her, in front of everyone gathered here, to build a future alongside me. Not because it is politically convenient, but because I cannot imagine a life that does not include her. The crowd's reaction rippled outward in waves, murmurs of approval mixing with genuine, unguarded cheering from those who had followed the story closely enough to understand its full weight. Lyra felt tears gathering that she made no effort to hide, understanding that this moment, standing openly and proudly beside the man she loved, in front of the very people who had once overlooked her existence entirely, represented everything she had once believed impossible for someone like her. She stepped forward to address the crowd herself, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. For years, she said, I believed that surviving meant disappearing, that the only way to stay safe was to make myself small enough that no one would ever notice me, ever remember my name, ever have reason to look for me twice. I built an entire life around that belief, and it kept me alive, but it also kept me alone, in every way that mattered. She looked out over the crowd, finding Edwin's familiar face among them, finding the faces of others from Camp 7, who had shared fires and hardship with her for years, without ever knowing the full truth of who she was. The flood changed that, she continued. Not because it revealed who I truly am to the world, though it certainly did that. It changed things, because it showed me that hiding had never actually been the same thing as safety. Real safety, I've learned, comes from people willing to stand beside you when the truth finally comes out, not from convincing yourself the truth should never be spoken at all. She reached for Draven's hand, and the crowd's reaction swelled again, warm and genuine, in a way that settled something deep and long guarded in her chest. I intend to use whatever position I now hold, she said, to make sure the camps like the one that sheltered me for years receive the support and dignity they deserve, not as an afterthought, but as a fundamental responsibility of this territory's leadership. No one should have to disappear the way I did simply to survive. That ends now. The announcement drew immediate, enthusiastic support from the gathered crowd, and in the weeks that followed, Lyra made good on that promise, with the same careful, determined focus she brought to everything in her life. Working alongside Draven's court, she began implementing reforms to the refugee camp systems across the territory, improved medical care, fairer distribution of resources, formal pathways for refugees to reclaim lost identities and rebuild lives beyond the temporary, precarious existence the camps had once represented. Camp 7 itself became something of a model for the reforms, its residents among the first to benefit from the improved systems Lyra personally oversaw, Edwin among the loudest and proudest voices championing the changes to anyone who would listen. Told you, he said to her once, during one of her regular visits back to the camp that had once been her entire world. That man wasn't wasting his effort on people who didn't deserve it. You told me a lot of things, she said, smiling. Most of them turned out to be right. Comes with age, he said, grinning. That, and good instincts about people. Months passed, the seasons shifting the valley from the raw devastation of flood damage into something greener and more settled, the rebuilt levees standing as a permanent marker of both the disaster that had once nearly claimed 2 lives and the unlikely beginning it had, against every reasonable expectation, actually represented. On a clear evening in early autumn, Draven and Lyra returned to that same levee, alone this time, away from the crowds and ceremony of the formal announcement months earlier. The valley below had healed considerably, new growth already softening the scars the flood had once left behind, the water running calm and unremarkable, in a way that made it difficult to remember, standing there, exactly how violent and deadly that same water had once been. Do you ever think about it? Draven asked, watching the gentle current below. How different everything would be, if you'd hesitated that day, if you'd decided the risk wasn't worth it. I think about it more than I probably should, she admitted. I didn't hesitate because I was brave. I hesitated because some part of me had already decided, without fully thinking it through, that watching someone drown when I could help was a worse outcome than risking myself to prevent it. I didn't know, in that moment, that it would change my entire life. I'm glad you didn't hesitate, he said, reaching for her hand the way he had so many times since that first conversation in the barn. Whatever the flood took from this valley, it gave me something I never expected to find. She leaned into him, watching the calm water below, thinking of the long road that had brought her from a nameless refugee, hiding at the edges of a camp system that barely acknowledged her existence, to standing here, on rebuilt ground, beside a man who had chosen her not, despite everything she had survived, but because of the strength that surviving it had built in her. I used to believe, she said quietly, that names got remembered, and remembered things got found, that staying hidden was the only way to stay safe. And now? She turned to look at him, at the steady certainty in his eyes that had never once wavered since the moment she'd pulled him from the flood, and felt, standing there on solid, rebuilt ground, a peace she had once believed entirely impossible for someone like her to ever fully claim. Now, she said, I think being found, by the right person, might be the safest thing that's ever happened to me. The evening light settled gold and warm over the valley, over the rebuilt levee, over two people who had found each other in the middle of a disaster, and chosen, against every careful instinct either of them had once relied on for survival, to build something lasting from what the flood had left behind. Below them, the water continued its calm, steady path through the valley, carrying nothing now but the quiet, ordinary rhythm of a river finally at peace, exactly the way the two people watching it had, at long last, found their own.